Hi everyone, thank you for joining. We'll just give a couple of more minutes for people to join the webinar and then we'll get started. We'll just give one more minute for people to join the webinar and then we'll get started. Thank you all for joining. I think we can get started now. So thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. It is about how to secure PR for your charity for the Christmas Challenge. We are very grateful to be joined by Becky Slack from Slack Communications today to deliver this webinar. So thank you, Becky, for joining us today.
Pleasure, thanks for having me.
And we also have myself on the call, on the webinar, and Alex Day, the director of the Big Give. I'll just quickly go over some housekeeping rules. So if anyone has any questions for Becky, please put them in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. So we'll let Becky deliver her presentation and then we'll put your questions to her at the end of the webinar. If you have any comments or if you want to introduce yourself to any of the other attendees or share your LinkedIn profile with your networking, please use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. Please make sure the to function is set to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see what you're writing. With that in mind, I'll hand it over now to Becky to get going.
Thank you very much, and lovely to be back. Very grateful for the opportunity to speak to everybody again. So as you know, we're going to be talking about PR. I'm going to whiz through it quite quickly. As Sahil says, if you want to ask questions, then please do. And also, I'm happy to follow up on any conversations at the end as well. So if you want to take a note of my details, then please do. So why am I here talking to you today about PR? So just a little bit of background for those of you who don't know me. I've spent about 20 years working in media and communications. I'm a qualified and trained journalist. I've worked on print and digital media, broadcast. I've worked for women's lifestyle publications, the charity sector trade press, mainstream consumer news and current affairs publications. So a real kind of broad cross-section as an actual journalist, and I still work as a freelancer today. I've worked in fundraising, and I have a small PR and communications agency called Slack Communications, and we work specifically with small to medium-sized charities, helping them communicate more widely, in particular through the medium of PR. So, you know, helping them work more effectively with journalists. And I've also written a book on the subject as well. And so it's all of that experience that I'm going to be bringing together today to hopefully help you do some really successful PR around the Big Give. And I've been a fundraiser on the Big Give as well. So last year I worked with a small charity called Prisoners of Conscience, fundraising for them through the Big Give. So I have some first-hand experience of what you're about to do as well. So hopefully it will be useful for you. So first of all, if you're going to do PR, you really, really need to understand the media themselves. So what is it that journalists want? What is it that they do? If we were in normal times and I was in a room with you, I'd be asking you to answer this question directly. But it's worth just giving it a little bit of thought, because the more you understand about the context that journalists are working in, the more you will understand what it is that they're looking for and how you can work with them successfully. So, I mean, ultimately, a journalist's job is to provide you, the society, with information that you need in order to exist in the world and go about your daily lives. We hold people and organisations to account. We enable you to participate in democratic life. We inform, sometimes we entertain. Sometimes we do both, sometimes we do neither. And really our job is to go out there and find those stories that are going to be of interest to our audiences, and to sort of present and collect information and filter out all the nonsense that's not important, check the lies and inaccuracies, and present you stories that are going to make a difference to your lives. So our priorities as a journalist is the story. We want to make sure that we are breaking the most interesting and exciting stories that are really going to make a difference to the world in some way. And as part of that, we're thinking about selling more newspapers and magazines, and also obviously we're in a digital world at the moment, and so it's also about more clicks and shares. And there's a whole load of, we're having a bit of a conversation before this started about what that means for the world, and there's a much more detailed conversation to be had in that. But basically what this means for you is that you need to be thinking as a journalist when you're pitching a story, and you need to think like a journalist. What is it that's going to be a good story from their point of view? When you're thinking about that, be mindful of the fact that journalists don't care about your key messages. They don't care about your fundraising targets. They don't care about the organizational structure. What they care about is the story. And so your job is to turn your work and the impact that you achieve as organizations into a story that's relevant for that journalist and the publication that they work for. It also means handing over control of that story to the journalist, which I understand can be quite a nerve-wracking thing to do. But journalists like to make their own decisions about what the story is and how it should be presented. So what does this mean in terms of what you can provide journalists with? The other thing to bear in mind about journalism is that journalists are very, very busy people. Their editorial teams have been cut down to the bare bones because there's not enough money coming into the industry at the moment. They have a million different story ideas that they can choose from, so they're under pressure. They need everything immediately or yesterday, and they work really, really fast. So this is both a challenge and an opportunity for charities. As far as the opportunity goes, it means that journalists are very open to ideas. They're open to not just news stories, but also features and case studies and opinion pieces and blogs and all the rest of it, which we'll come on to in more detail in a moment. So there's lots of opportunity for you there, but the challenge is that you need to be able to provide that information in a way that's appropriate for the journalist. So the information you give them has to be reliable and accurate. It has to be provided fast, and it's got to be in the right format. So if a journalist says to you, I want a comment that's no more than 100 words by Tuesday at 5 p.m, that is what you give them. You don't give them more or less on a different date. So it's really important that you follow the strict instructions that a journalist will give you. But again, we'll come on to that in a bit more detail. First of all, I want to talk about what a story is, because it means different things to different people. Ultimately, a story from a journalistic point of view is something that's new, and that's really important. Journalists don't like writing about stuff that's been covered before, unless it provides a new and slightly different angle to it. And it has to be unique and different. It has to kind of make people pay attention and want to read on and find out more. So sort of, I quite often get charities saying to me, oh, you know, I wish these journalists, the media would write about how great we are. And it's kind of like, well, you know, charities are supposed to do good work. There's nothing kind of unique or different about that. So your job as charity communications professionals and as fundraisers is to show journalists what it is that's unique and different about your work. What is it that people should be paying attention to? How are you transforming people's lives? And again, there's loads of opportunity for you there, because I know that your organizations do some really fantastic work, and you're making, you know, life-changing transformation for the communities that you work within. So it's up to you to be able to present that in a way that's really going to grab the attention of a journalist. Your story also needs to be relevant to that particular media's audience. So local media, for example, which I would imagine that many of your organisations will want to appear in. If a publication is, if it covers a particular area in, let's say, I don't know, Peterborough, then they're only going to be interested in stories that have happened in Peterborough, not Cambridge, not Manchester or anywhere else, Peterborough. So you need to be very, very specific. Likewise, if you want to appeal to women's lifestyle magazines, then the story would have to be about a woman. If you want to appeal to men's health magazines, then the story has got to be related to men's health. So it's kind of obvious, really. But I know from experience of being on the receiving end of lots of pitches and proposals from charities that they don't always pay attention to that. I've been asked to cover all kinds of stories that are just not relevant or appropriate for the publications that I've been working on. So, you know, pay real close attention to who the audience is, and make sure that you provide stories that fit that. And then the other really important thing is stories about real life people. So people like to know about other people. We're inherently curious about other people's lives. As fundraisers, you know that people give to people, they don't give to organizations. And so it's kind of the same principle with PR. You know, we want to, as journalists, we want to be writing about amazing things that people have been doing. And so if you can find some really good, engaging case studies of people who have done some interesting or unique things, and you as an organisation, you've changed their life in a particular way, then that's exactly the sort of story that the media is going to be looking for. There's a whole load of theory around what makes a story, which we don't have time for today. To kind of summarize it into one nice, easy to remember kind of soundbite is the so what test. So when you're looking at your story, you need to ask yourself, like, is a journalist going to say so what to this? Is anybody but you going to care about this story? How is it going to add value to the readers or the viewers' lives? Why do they need to know this information? Does it tell the reader something they don't already know? And really importantly, why is this a story and not an advert? Journalists really, you know, they want their editorial integrity, and they are not going to want to write something that would be considered like PR, like marketing. And unfortunately, quite a lot of the pitches and proposals that I get in as a journalist, sorry for the background noise if you can hear that, the family that live upstairs in my flat have just come home. Yeah, you know, the story has got to have editorial value. PR should not be an extension of your marketing department. PR is about working with journalists on stories, on proper stories. So make sure that what you're pitching actually achieves that and isn't just an advert. Otherwise, you'll find that publications will be emailing you back saying, yes, you can take out an advertorial on this and charging you money for it. So just to give you some ideas of what stories are and how to translate your work into stories. This is from 2017, so it's a little bit old, but it's still relevant. So it's from when Fareshare was the charity of the year for the Telegraph newspaper for the Christmas appeal. And 3 different stories here. We've got a news analysis piece, which is all about the scale of food waste in the UK and around the world. And this was quite a clever story because Fareshare, it was somebody else's statistic. Normally, when you're pitching a news story, you would want to use your own data and it would need to be new. But I think in the absence of that, Fareshare had used a statistic from another organisation, the UN's Food and Agricultural Organisation, and turned that into a news story that was relevant for them and their work. We've got a lifestyle piece here, which is about how to waste less in the kitchen this Christmas, and it was a recipe about using carrot tops and beetroot leaf. So again, it was communicating the key messages of the charity, but doing it in a way that was kind of created a nice piece for the Telegraph. And then the final piece here is on how the government can help to turn all this wasted food into meals for the needy. And this focused on a case study of a farmer, it basically was kind of like a how-to, it was a nice how-to feature. So we've got news, we've got a recipe, and we've got a case study led feature. Same organization, same publication, but same set of key messages, but 3 different types of stories. So try and think kind of creatively about how you might create content that's useful and interesting for the publication. Some other examples here from Candice magazine. So Sober for October with Macmillan. This has been running for quite a number of years. They did a piece on how going sober can improve your sleep and make you more productive. The charity didn't really feature at the heart of it. It was more about the, why is Sober October good for the individual, good for Candice's reader. So again, it's not about putting your organisation at the heart of the story. It's about how can you present the work that you do in a way that's useful and relevant for the reader. We've got a nice case study here in the middle about how a charity has changed people's lives, and there's some really beautiful pictures here. And I think this is one of the other things that I think you need to take away from today, is that pictures and photos are going to be really important. Again, I've had lots of situations where I've had a good story, but I've not been able to run with it because there haven't been any decent pictures. And particularly if you are pitching a case study that involves an individual or a family, it's really good for the reader to be able to see that family and see those individuals, so they can put a face to the story. And I appreciate that can be quite difficult if you work for charities where your beneficiaries need to remain anonymous. But I would urge you to try and find a way around it. Stock photos are not great. They're used all over the place. They're quite boring. Everyone knows their stock photos. Journalists don't like to use them. So if you can find a way to have proper photos, then that's going to support your PR in a positive way. And then again, just this final one on WWF Earth Hour. Again, the charity wasn't the main focus of the story. It was about what the audience of that publication can do to contribute to Earth Hour. So I think the message from this is it's not about you, it's about people. And you need to place the audience at the heart of everything that you do, which is what you should be doing in fundraising anyway. So I'm teaching you to suck eggs a little bit here. Apologies for that. And then just finally, just a local media example. As I've mentioned, if you're going to do local media, the story has to be local. It has to be about somebody or something that has happened in the local area, and it has to be interesting and relevant to the people in the local area. And it needs to offer, again, something that's got a little bit of uniqueness. So just this Congo story here, where there's a grandmother will spend Christmas abroad in the fight against Ebola. The reason that this was unique is that the woman who was going out there was a grandmother. It kind of got a nice little sort of edge to it. There's a contrast between Yorkshire village life to the Congo. She was giving up her Christmas, she wasn't spending it with her own family. She was going to go and fight this really dangerous disease. So that's, there's lots going on in that story that's really nice. So again, audience is the key takeaway. Like, what is unique and different, and how is this relevant for the publication's audience? So I mentioned earlier that journalists aren't just interested in news. News is great, but news, it has to be new. The clue is in the title. And as soon as something is out there on social media or on your own website, that reduces its news value. Also, in the news arena, you are competing against a lot of other news stories. And it's possible that your story might not get picked up because there's too much other stuff that's going on, particularly at the moment with coronavirus. There's not a lot of space for other stuff because the world's media is quite rightly focused on that. On that note, if you can find a way to link your work to coronavirus and provide a different angle, ideally something positive, on the coronavirus story, then that could be a nice way to start a conversation with a journalist about a story. But an alternative to news are features and opinion pieces and case studies. These are less time, can be less time sensitive. And I know from my own work as a journalist, quite often I'll get sent a press release. It won't quite be relevant for what I'm doing, or it just won't have enough news value to be used. But there's something in it that I think is quite interesting and that my readers might be interested in. And I will try and find a way of turning it into a feature or a case study. Or it might be that there was the reason for the news piece, there's an opinion piece within that. So, if you send out press releases and they're not picked up as news, don't despair, because there's other options too. So news, just very quickly to run through this slide, just so it's clear what the differences are. News is a hard news story. It's reporting the facts. It's telling people something that they don't already know. Features are there's slightly longer articles and programs that you will see that usually cover. Quite often they're generated off the back of a news story. It's an opportunity to sort of delve into an issue in a bit more detail. Opinion pieces and blogs is the other thing, op-eds. The key with an opinion piece is, again, a bit like news, the clue is in the title. You have to be opinionated if you're going to pitch an opinion piece. You cannot play it safe with these things, otherwise it's boring and it's never going to get picked up. Now, the challenge with that is that opinion pieces are by their very nature quite divisive and can be controversial, polarizing, and so you need to be quite committed to sticking your head above the parapet if you want to run a successful opinion piece. And also, again, ideally they should be linked to the current news agenda, which means you need to be able to turn them around really, really quickly. So, for example, Hannah Fern, who's the editor of Indie Voices on the independent newspaper, she looks for comment pieces that are linked to what is going on in the news that day. And normally, if a news story is broken in the morning, she likes to be running the opinion piece by sort of lunchtime, no later. So if you want to do that kind of content that's linked to your work, you need to be able to turn it around really quickly, and you need to be willing to stick your head above the parapet. News in brief, these are those tiny little, down the edge of the news side of the newspaper, you might get just a little paragraph about something, but also quite often newspapers and magazines, particularly online, they'll do photos and captions, infographics, that kind of thing, stuff that's easily shareable on social media. So have a think about, if you can't provide a traditional news story in the traditional sense of the word, is there a way of turning your your work into something that's a different type of story with a different format? Have a look at the publications that you would like coverage on, and see how they present information, and if there's a way in which you can work with that. And then case studies, you all know what case studies are. You use these in your day-to-day lives all the time. But just to excuse me, just to show how this works in reality. So let's say that a charity has written a report about how 2 million older people are going to spend Christmas alone. How might you present this in different ways for different types of media? So from a news point of view, it might be a hard, straight news story that says 2 million older people will spend Christmas alone, finds report by Charity X. That's quite kind of, traditional news story. And a feature, maybe for a women's lifestyle magazine or a local kind of lifestyle publication, might be something along the lines of, inviting a lonely older person for dinner this Christmas is more than a nice gesture. You could save their life, and it could have a comment and case study from the charity. The opinion piece, it's a social disgrace that 2 million pensioners will be on their own this Christmas. Nibs, so news in brief, 10 ways to reduce your plastic consumption this Christmas shopping season. And instead of number 4 might be, instead of presents, buy a Christmas dinner for a lonely pensioner from this particular charity. And then the case study, an example of somebody that the charity has helped, going into detail about how that's happened and what difference has been made. So you can see you've got one report, same information, but 5 different ways of presenting that that would be relevant for different types of media. So how do you pitch? And this is quite important to start thinking about this now, so that you've got a long enough lead-in time. I know that you've still got a little bit of time before the big give actually happens, but if you can be thinking ahead and getting all the different bits and pieces of information together now, then that will stand you in really good stead. So first of all, you need to identify your story. So how do you do that? Well, from your own organisational point of view, who is it that you want to reach, and what is going to be interesting to those people? Apply the so what test. Do you know information that others don't? Who are the people that are involved? What are the case studies that you've got? Can you find a way to make your work link to the wider news agenda? Are you prepared to stick your head above the parapet and say something controversial to get people talking? What is your story? The fact that you are participating in the big give it's a story to a degree. The fact that it's going to double donations, now that's nice, but from a media point of view, you need to think about which publications are going to care about the fact that you're participating in the big give. It's probably a local media story rather than, well, it's definitely not a national media story. National journalists aren't particularly going to care about this because it's not big enough, unless of course you raise record-breaking amounts of money, in which case that's different. But I think from your point of view, so that you are not wasting your valuable time trying to pitch stories into media where it's not of interest, I would focus on local and specialist media. As I say, unless you've got something really unique and exciting that's really, really different. Make sure that you focus on the impact. So it's all very well, the fact that you're a charity and you're trying to raise money. And particularly in today's climate, it's very difficult to raise money, and there's lots of other organisations competing for donors' pounds. That's not particularly very interesting to most journalists. What we care about is the difference that you make. So what impact will this fundraising activity, what impact will the Big Give Christmas Challenge have on the world and society? And try and focus on that as much as you possibly can. Talk about the difference that you make, how that relates to normal life, and why it's so important that people get behind you so that you can do more of this great work. Once you've identified your story, you then need to match it to the media. So which newspapers, which magazines, which broadcasters are going to be interested in your story? And as I've said, I think local media is a really, really good place to start, particularly for small local organisations. And then also specialist media, and I've got an example to show you with regards to that in a little while. But just to give you an idea what I mean about specialist media, this could be hobby publications, they could be specialist trade magazines, depending on which sectors you work in. So it's basically, or the special supplements that go inside more mainstream publications. So think niche and try and be as specific as possible. Obviously, we've spoken about audience quite a lot. Think also with regards to the publication, what sort of media is it? If it's radio, obviously you need to think audio. Like, can you do live or pre-recorded voice calls? How would you do that? Have you got the functionality to be able to do that? Can you put journalists in front of your case studies so that they can interview them? Can you make that happy? Same for TV. Is it online? What does that mean? What are the deadlines as well? That's the other really important thing to think about, which is why it's important that you start thinking about this now. Just to give you an example, when I worked on Slimming World magazine, which is a women's weight loss title, we used to work on our Christmas content in June and July for the magazine. Obviously, for the website, that was very different. We could upload stuff much, in a much more timely manner. Weekly magazines and weekly newspapers will work to a different set of press deadlines to daily publications. So think very carefully about how your timelines will fit with the press deadlines of the publications that you want to work with. Also, just because a media has a website, don't assume that there's an option there just to upload stuff willy-nilly. Journalists and editors, even with website publications, they have very strict content plans and content production schedules. So you need to make sure that you're working with them on that. So if necessary, if you think you've got a really, really good story and you don't know what the timeline is for that particular publication, then pick up the phone and see if you can speak to the editor and pitch the story in and have a chat with them about when they would need the information. Ask the question rather than making assumptions. Just to give you another example of how you might want to pitch the same story to 3 different titles. So this is a report from, again, it's a couple of years ago, but it's a nice example about how women, a charity did a report on about how women are being denied cesarean birth options. And so we've got Elle magazine, women's lifestyle publication. It very much focused on the story from the point of view of the woman, what it means for them. They did a poll on, do you think everyone should be given the choice of a C-section? Then you've got the Nursing Times, which presented the information from the point of view of the midwives and from the hospital trusts. And then down at the bottom here, we've got one from The Guardian, which was a much more kind of general focus and featured quite a nice case study about what it was like to be one of these women who didn't have the option of the C-section. So 3 different titles, same report, same information, but 3 different ways of presenting it. So think quite creatively about your stories and how you might be able to package them up differently depending on the media that you're approaching. So once you've got your story and you think you found, you've identified which media you want to pitch your story to, how do you know whether it's actually going to be successful or not? So one way in which you can test your story's strength is to think about what the potential headlines are. What is your dream headline for that publication to run? And if you can't find an interesting or newsworthy headline, then your story probably isn't interesting or newsworthy. And have a look at the publication and see how they write their headlines and what type of headlines they run, because that will give you an idea as to the type of stories that they're looking for. If the media has covered that type of story before, then you need to find a way of doing it differently. If they haven't covered that type of story before, then you need to ask whether you think they're going to cover it this time. And then also, if you've sort of ticked all of those boxes, you need to actually think about whether or not you can deliver everything that's going to be needed, and in time as well. There is nothing worse, I'm going to reiterate this point several times throughout this webinar, but there's nothing worse from a journalistic point of view if you're working with somebody on a story and they don't meet the deadline and give you the information in the format that you want it in. But if somebody says to you, oh, I can get you a really good case study, it's this person who's really amazing, and my chief executive will talk to you and they'll say this, that and the other, and you think, oh great, this is going to be really interesting. And then they can't get an interview with the case study, or the chief executive won't say the things that you've been told they will. That's really disappointing. And it's, as a busy journalist, you don't want to waste your time on stories like that. So make sure that if you're going to pitch something out, that you can actually deliver everything that you say you can. You need to find the right journalist to pitch to, particularly local media. Each journalist will have a particular patch or a particular sort of theme that they cover. They might be the health correspondent, the politics correspondent. So you need to figure out which journalist is going to be the person who writes about your work. It's also worth, if you're going to send a press release in, it's also worth including the newsroom. because that way, then if the journalist you've emailed doesn't pick your story up for whatever reason, there's a chance that whoever's monitoring the news inbox might pick it up instead. And then you need to pitch. So what's the best way to actually make an approach? It varies journalist to journalist, but the majority of the journalists that I speak to, and from my own point of view, making the approach first of all via email is always the best way. You can pick up the phone and try and talk to somebody, but I can guarantee that if you try and pitch a story and you've not already sent them an email about it, they will ask you to send them an email. So you may as well just, save everybody's time and send the email. As far as follow-up goes, I would recommend then sending another email as the follow-up, and then picking up the phone. If your email isn't picked up first time around, don't lose hope. Again, when I was just working as a journalist and I was editing a number of different publications, I was getting between sort of 100 and 250 emails a day with different approaches and press releases and things. That's just you can't keep on top of that, and so it's very easy to miss press releases. So don't think, oh, I've emailed them and they've not replied, so they obviously don't want my story. It could just be that they've just not seen it. So follow up again. In fact, I think there's some research by PR Agility Newswire that suggests that it's the second email has something like, I don't know, 64% better chance of being picked up than the first email. So just to sort of reiterate, don't give up on the first attempt, but if by the third attempt they've not replied or not responded, then it probably means that you're out of luck. So should you send a tailored approach or a blanket email? I tend to do a mixture of the two. I will identify maybe 5 or 6 journalists that we really want to work with and send tailored approaches to them. And then I will send out a blanket email to everybody else. That way, you're kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone. You've got the opportunity to have those kind of very specific, very tailored conversations with the priority journalists, but you also get the opportunity to secure some pickup within other media as well. So I would suggest doing both. As I've said, be persistent. Make sure that you chase. And when you send your email, ideally you should send it from a named account, not just an info@ email box. And try and use the journalist's first name, and be polite and ask them how they're doing, etc. You don't need to go into loads of details. You can just send the release, but normally if you put a little note at the top saying, I think this is the area that an area that you might be interested in, or I saw another story that you did that was very similar, would you be interested in this as a follow-on piece? Try and personalize it as much as possible. As I've mentioned, journalists are really busy, and the last thing that you want to be doing is, you've got a 6 o'clock deadline. It's 5:30. You've got one little bit of information that's missing from your story. The charities office is shut because everyone goes home at 5 o'clock, and you're left stumped. You can't, you don't know what, you're just having to rewrite the whole story because this one bit of information is missing and you can't get hold of everybody. So the more information that you can provide at the time, the better. Ideally, if you can set up a Dropbox or some sort of Google shared drive where you can put everything that they possibly may need, press-friendly images, so high-res images, any video that you've got, press releases, links to other sources, provide them with everything they can possibly need, so they don't have to keep coming backwards and forwards, because it's really time-consuming to do that, and as a journalist you just don't have any spare time. So anything that you can do to make a journalist's life easier is welcome, and will win you lots of brownie points. So you have been successful, you've pitched the story, the journalist has said yes, brilliant. Now it's now you've got to deliver. And I know I've been banging on about this throughout this whole webinar, but it's so important that you follow the instructions. If they say they want it by 2 o'clock on Wednesday, that's when they want it for. If you can't deliver on time, then you need to let them know in plenty of time so that they can find an alternative. Also, don't ask to see to sign off on the story before it runs. It's very, very unlikely that will happen, because as I say here, you do not control the story, they do. The only time when that might be different is if you've pitched quite a sensitive case study, and you want to make sure that that person's life is being represented accurately. That's, you can ask to see sight of the copy beforehand then, but generally speaking, if it's just a news story or an ordinary feature of some description, then it's unlikely that they're going to give you sign off, because a journalist will present the information in the way that they want to, and it's just too painful sometimes if you've got a charity that's quibbling over a word. You're just not going to do that. And as I reiterate here, if you can't deliver something, either offer an alternative or give them plenty of warning. To not deliver when you've promised will get you loads of black marks against your name, and they won't come back to you. And then once the story has gone live and you're really excited and happy with your coverage, make sure you share it. As I've mentioned, we, as a journalist, as the media, we want our stories to be read. Shareability is really, really important. It's something that we look for in the content that we run. And so the more that you can do to share that story around, the better for the publication as well as yourselves. And then just finally, treat journalists as you would your donors. These can be very, important and influential people for your organisations and for your work. Make sure you thank them. You don't have to be gushing or send them flowers or anything like that, but just an email just to say thank you for the story, and maybe a tweet to say thank you for the story as well. That can also win you some friends and make those journalists feel appreciated. So I'm just going to give you some examples from last year's Big Give of some really good coverage that might give you a little bit of inspiration. So the first one here, so this is an example of broadcast coverage from the Y in Leicestershire, and their communications manager Emma and a girl called Lauren, who was the focus of the case study, they went to BBC Radio Leicester to talk about the issues faced by young people trying to get into work. So note this, so they weren't talking about the why, or the Big Give Christmas Challenge kind of came into it, but the priority focus for this story was the issues faced by the young people getting into work. And as Emma says this quote here, this made for great content to share with our followers and really offered something to an ongoing discussion about benefits, supported housing and marginalised young people. So they did a really good job of connecting the work that they do as an organisation with the wider news agenda, and they put the case study Lauren at the heart of that to talk about it. So that was really nice. That was what made it a story from BBC Radio Leicester's point of view. It wasn't the fact that they were participating in the Christmas Challenge, although that was also discussed. It was about the work that the organisation is doing and how that fits with the wider news agenda. A more simple approach that you can all do is with local media. And so here we've got Birmingham Hippodrome and the Express and Star newspaper. They did a before and after. So the before story was about how they've joined the Big Give to raise £20,000 to give the gift of theatre, with some nice pictures. And then the follow-up was that it raised a record-breaking £28,000, and again with another nice photo. And I think actually this is probably what makes this story, particularly if you're kind of thinking about, I've got a choice of stories, one of them's got an image, one of them doesn't, you're going to run with the story that's got the image. So make sure you don't forget about that. And then this is an example of how to work with specialist media on something that's not news related. So this is from when I was working with Prisoners of Conscience last Christmas. And they work with a very vulnerable group, people who don't want to be identified. So we couldn't use case studies. It wasn't a local organisation, so we couldn't work with local news. So we kind of had to think a bit carefully about how we could get some PR about our work to support the Big Give Christmas Challenge. And so the money we were raising was going to help prisoners of conscience now living in the UK get into work. And so we thought, right, well, we'll do a blog on the 6 qualities that will get you hired. And what we did was we used it as an opportunity to build some networks with some corporates, some recruitment consultancies. And we asked those recruitment consultancies to give some top tips for how to get hired. And then we turned this into an article that was then published by HR News. And at the bottom, you can see at the bottom just here, it mentioned the Big Give Christmas Challenge. So it got us PR, it enabled us to work with corporates, and it enabled us to plug the Big Give Christmas Challenge. And then obviously we shared it across all of our social media platforms as well. So just an example there of how to think perhaps a little bit differently and how to take a slightly different approach to coverage. Just very quickly, I know that people are very busy and that you don't have time for all of this, particularly when you've got to contact all your donors and you've got your social media work to do. And so there's a special offer here for any organisation that wants it, where we will do your PR for you. It's the equivalent of about 2 days worth of work, and we'll help you identify your stories, identify the media, do all the pitching for you, including via our database, and then we'll follow up on any of the queries. But there's only 3 spaces available, so I'll just leave that with you there. Any questions? Sahil, I don't know, is this where you come back in?
Yeah, thank you, Becky. Thank you for delivering that. That was very interesting. Yeah, we do have questions for you. So yeah, I'll dive straight in. We have one from Alex Hendon. It says, if you have a story for a particular date, how much time in advance should you send the piece?
Again, it depends on the publication and how frequently they publish, but I would say a couple of weeks beforehand, just to give the journalist a chance to understand the story. If you've got to book in interviews with any case studies, you want to make sure that you've got enough time to do that as well. So I would say 2 weeks. However, if you find that you've got a really good story and it's happening the next day, then there's no reason why you can't also pick up the phone and try and still pitch it in. But I would say 2 weeks is a good starting point.
Great. And actually, we just had a question from Louise about how to get in touch in regards to your PR package. What's the best way to get in touch? If you want to
email, if you email me at this email address that's on the screen now, I would love to talk with you. Thank you.
Great. We had one from Emma Mulholland. How do you recommend sourcing relevant press contacts? Is it worth investing in a paid database?
It can be. I mean, the reason that we have the paid database is because we do campaigns for multiple organisations across multiple different sort of topics. So it would be quite time consuming for us to do it without the use of a database. But if you are only doing PR on an infrequent basis, or you know that it's a very specialised area and there's maybe only a handful of journalists that you actually really want to talk to and who are going to be interested in your work, then I wouldn't bother. I would just use, Google and, identify the publications first that you want to appear in. I think that's the starting point. And then, most publications, if they've got a hard copy, there's normally what's called a flannel panel. It's quite often on the contents page or somewhere, somewhere in the magazine anyway, or the newspaper, there'll be details of who writes and which areas they cover. And also, if it's online, there's quite often an About Us section where you can get editorial contacts as well. So I think it depends on the volume of PR that you're going to be doing and the scale of topic areas.
Right. We did have another question about someone's asking if they find an angle that's newsworthy for national media, are they likely to get any journalists sharing the link to the Big Give and appeal itself, or will it be more about raising awareness of our causes, the work, and hoping people visit the website as a result? I think you covered that slightly in just at the end, but yeah, if you'd like to go over that again.
Yeah, with national coverage, what you've got to remember is, why is this of interest to a national audience, and why is this story more important than another story of national importance? And it's very unlikely that, I mean, quite often journalist editors don't even include links to the websites of the organisations who are, you know, involved with the story. Would they include the link to the big give? I don't know. It depends on the publication. Okay, so one of the things that quite a lot of titles are now doing as a means of making more money is selling links and making people pay for them, because it, you know, it's a revenue generator for the publication, and it's directing traffic away from their site to somebody else's site, which as a journalist, as an editor, you don't particularly want to be doing. You want to keep people on your site. So quite a lot of publications these days are charging people for the privilege of links, or they don't include them at all. So it's case by case dependent.
Is it just worth asking the whoever you're dealing with if they would be happy to include it?
Yeah,
great.
Ask the question, but don't be surprised if they say no.
Great. Hermione Ruff asks, what is the best approach for building relationships with local press? Is there a particular tactic, or is it what you've already said before?
Yeah, so it's really difficult to build relationships with journalists full stop, whether it's local or not, because they're so busy. And also, you know, particularly with lockdown and coronavirus, our roles as journalists they've kind of changed. We're having to do everything from behind our desks, whereas before we might go out and about and meet people and go to events and things. So I would suggest Twitter is a really good way to build a relationship with somebody. So start off by maybe sharing some of their content and liking it and commenting on the bottom of it. Then maybe ask them some questions, you know, like try and build up a relationship with them using Twitter. Don't bombard them with loads of emails, because as I've said, like, we get tons and tons of emails and it's just too much. So it's really frustrating when people just keep sending you emails all the time. So if you can use Twitter, then do. And if you've got something really special going on, invite journalists along. Obviously within the constraints of what's possible with lockdown and quarantine, etc. But if you've got an online event taking place, for example, you know, invite journalists along to that. Basically, whatever opportunity you've got to make friends with them, then do that. Also, I mean, another way to kind of become a trusted contact of a journalist is to send them leads. So, you know, if you hear on the grapevine that something is happening, and you think that's going to be interesting to the media, then give them the story, even if it doesn't necessarily relate to your work, because the more that you can become a trusted contact, the stronger your relationship will become with that journalist.
Great advice. And yeah, just on the Twitter thing, I follow quite a few journalists on my personal Twitter, and I noticed some of them actually have their DMs are open, their messaging is open for stories. So if they do have that in their bio, that's always a good chat as well.
Yeah, exactly. But again, don't spam them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely remember that.
Otherwise, just be that annoying person, and it's like, oh God, it's them again, not which you don't want to be.
Yeah. Alex actually had another question. Is in relation to contacting journalists, what kind of time scale would you recommend for following up? Wait a week, or is that?
As far as you broke up a little bit then. As far as
yeah, following up on emails you sent to a journalist, what kind of timescale would you recommend?
Yeah, so again, this depends on how much time you've given yourself to sort of pitch in. So let's say you've worked 2 weeks in advance and you've sent the first email. I would leave it a couple of days and then follow up the second time, and then maybe a couple of days again. And you know, if it's an urgent breaking news story, then you have to work much faster than that. So I mean, I wouldn't kind of, you know, send a press release in the morning and then because you've not heard from them that afternoon, follow up then. You know, that's just, you know, putting too much pressure on. That's not an achievable or realistic response rate.
And you'd recommend about like after the initial email, about 2 follow-ups, and then sort of if they don't follow up after the third one, then it's you had your answer as such.
Yeah. And another way to follow up actually is if you've sent over an initial news story you might want to follow up with some blog ideas or some feature ideas and say, look, you know, if the news story isn't of interest to you, perhaps you might be interested in presenting it in this light instead, because that gives you another way in and another opportunity to talk to them about us with a slightly different angle.
That's good advice there. Yeah, there's always never hurts to ask the worst thing they can say is no. Someone's asked, should the press release be in the body of the email or as an attachment?
No, do it as the body of an email. Definitely don't just send it as a PDF, because no one's going to open that, because there's a fear of viruses and whatever, and also it's just, for busy journalists, it's just one click too many. So yeah, include it in the email, and then you can always include it as a Word document as an attachment as well, but I would definitely include it in the body of the email. Great.
Claire Bailey just asks, photos are a bit of an issue when their support currently is mostly virtual. Would journalists use a pre-COVID related photo instead?
Yeah, I mean, as long as it accurately represents your work, then yeah, I would have thought so. It depends on the story. If it's, you know, if the story is specifically about something that's happened, you know, that day relating to COVID, then I don't know, you might need to think a bit creatively about it. But yeah, so it depends on the story. But yeah, there's no reason why not.
Is there a best day to pitch a story? Is there generally less news on a weekend, so increases the chance of getting coverage?
So pre-COVID, it used to be that you didn't pitch on a Monday morning or a Friday afternoon, normally because Friday afternoons, most journalists are in the pub. Maybe that's just the ones I hang out with. But because of COVID, and everyone's working hours are so different now, particularly when everyone was in lockdown. I knew of lots of journalists who, particularly they were having to homeschool their kids as well as try and do their jobs. And, you know, they were getting up really early in the morning to do their work so that then they could take time in the middle of the day to homeschool their children. And then they were working late at night. So it's a little bit hit and miss, really. Sunday afternoons, I quite often spend my time clearing out my inbox and reading stuff and thinking about whether I want to, you know, use it later on that week. So I don't know. I mean, maybe trial it and send it at a particular time, and then follow up at a different time. It depends on the publication. When they go to press, there's a whole range of different answers to give to that. I think it's just trial and error, I'm afraid.
I can really understand that. Should charities try and plug the stories into trending news topics beyond COVID? So, for example, Black Lives Matter. Would you recommend trying that angle? If it's
yeah. I mean, the only reason I mentioned COVID as a kind of, you know, current news agenda item is just because it's on my mind. But yeah, like any of the big stories of the day, and particularly if you can find a new and different angle for that gives the journalists an opportunity to keep talking about that issue but in a different way, then that's a good thing.
And if a charity already has like a celebrity supporter, should they always mention it in the story? Does that always automatically improve the interest for the journalist to write the story, or is it more based on the substance of what is actually being pitched?
I think if it's a consumer-facing publication, it can be very helpful to mention that you've got a celebrity supporter involved, because like personality sells, and the higher profile that supporter, the better. I mean, you know, you've only got to look at Free School Meals story to see that. I mean, like, you know, Marcus Rashford has done wonders for that story. If it had been the chief executive of the charity trying to, you know, raise awareness of free school meals, it's unlikely that it would have had as much success. I think it's the celebrity that adds that extra kind of authority, for want of a better word, to the story. But if you're trying to pitch to a trade magazine, then they're not going to care about celebrity.
And how important are like statistics and surveys / reports for improving a story? Does that always do journalists want that sort of back up to the story to like quantify a bit more?
Yeah, great context. If you've got new data that hasn't been covered before, then that's your hook. You know, a good headline is, you know, X% of people do this, or 50% of, you know, whatever this happens to. So having a good statistic can be a really good news hook. If you haven't got new data of your own, can you bring various data sets together to kind of create a new angle on some old data? But yeah, data is good. It helps provide context. So yeah, anything that where you've got data, like that's, yeah, it's a good thing.
I had one final question is, if you're a charity working in a couple of different locations, maybe across the UK, is it better to try and like syndicate stories across local press or try and go national press? Is there any sort of methodology in that?
I would go maybe both. I mean, if you're working in lots of different local areas, then you know, approach the journalists for those local newspapers, but be mindful that quite a lot of local newspapers are all owned by the same media group. And you might have one journalist that covers health for like 8 or 9 or more like local publications, local newspapers across different regions. So you might only need to speak to one journalist in order to get coverage in loads of different areas. The key is to make sure that you're speaking to the right journalist for that area, and you're not trying to pitch them a story that's for an area that they don't cover. And if you've got national reach, then, you know, by all means try and go for nationals, but you know, you've got to think about why your story is good enough and strong enough to knock somebody else's story off of the page. So, you know, you need to make sure that you're going to have national impact, and that particularly the case study or the data, you know, if you've just done a new report and you've got some really significant research that you can use, or you've got a really good case study where somebody's transformed their life in a really amazing way. But it's, you know, if you're going to go for the nationals, you've got to have a really, really good story. You've got to think about it in the scale of, you know, there will have thousands of people pitching stories at them, and you've got to try and make yours stand out.
Yeah, thanks for answering that question. I think we've run out of time now, so we'll wrap up now. But thank you again, Becky, for joining us today and delivering this webinar. It's been really interesting, and I hope all the charities have found it very useful. I know we have. I actually probably want to plug something before we sign off, is that we've sent charities a survey just to find out the state of the charity sector ahead of the Christmas giving season. And if you haven't already filled out the survey, please can you do so. This is helping us formulate our own PR strategy, and the more data we have back, the more information we can take to the press, and there's a possibility that we may feature your charity in any stories that we run. And as an added bonus, we'll be donating £100 each to 3 randomly selected charities that complete the survey. So if you haven't already filled out the survey, please can you do so by next Tuesday. With that in mind, thank you again, Becky, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. And like I say, if anybody wants to ask me any more questions, then please do. If it's just a question, then maybe get me on Twitter. But if it's something more detailed than that, then email.
Absolutely. Thanks for having those communication lines open for the charities. Thank you again for the charities.
All the best of luck. It's really exciting. So it's such a good thing for charities. I think the Big Give's a really great opportunity for everybody.
Thanks for the endorsement. Thank you again for everyone for attending. I hope you all have an enjoyable weekend. See you later. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.